Over the past 2 years, the majority of the projects I deal with have been the latter, EV charging solutions. Last year, we installed hundreds of different chargers throughout various facilities, but the majority of them were actually in multifamily residential buildings. Pretty much every building is different in regards to available parking, available power, the parking layout, tenant relations, board involvement, the presence of electric vehicles, etc. Due to all the possible scenarios, every project begins with an initial assessment to discuss these factors and how EV charging can best be implemented in your specific building. Here are a few main points that I like to discuss before proposing an EV charging project. How many chargers are you actually looking to install? Most of the time, this is going to directly relate to how much available parking you have and how much available power you have. If there were no limitations on parking or power, I usually recommend putting chargers in 10% of the total parking spaces. That is the current building code for new construction buildings, which is actually being increased soon. There is no code for existing buildings, but we usually use 10% as a baseline recommendation for that reason. Buildings may decide to do less or more than that based on the current presence of electric vehicles in the building and their anticipated future presence. If available parking spaces are limited, I usually see if there are any guest, flex, or visitor or vacant spots that can be utilized for chargers at all. If there are no available spaces, then we may recommend installing the chargers in the spaces that are most practical, and tenants with EVs then must switch spaces with the current tenants in those spaces. Or sometimes we'll even space the chargers out throughout the whole garage so that every parking space is basically within reach of a charger. If positioned strategically, one charger may reach up to 4 spaces in a parking garage. The chargers all have software that allow reservations and idling penalties to help manage these shared charger scenarios. If there is limited available power in the building, the same software can help monitor the load of the chargers so that they will not overload your electric service. The chargers can be installed so that the first car or cars that plug in get the maximum output. And as more cars plug in, that output is reduced. If there is really no available power, then we can perform an electrical service upgrade in coordination with the utility company to provide more power to the building for EV charging. Another point that we discussed, obviously, is where should you install the chargers? The chargers can be installed anywhere, technically. They are rated for indoor or outdoor and can be wall-mounted or freestanding. Indoor wall-mounted chargers are usually a cheaper installation. Outdoor freestanding usually involve trenching for the electrical conduits and wiring, and a concrete footing, which usually tends to increase the project cost somewhat. Proximity to the main electrical source is also recommended to keep the project cost down. As long as it's practical, I usually recommend using spaces as close to the main electric source as possible. The chargers will need to come from the main electric source most of the time because they draw a significant amount of power. The main electric source is usually in your electric room, where the utility meter is located. There are potential rebates for the chargers, which can double in amount if the chargers are publicly accessible rather than privately. So that may be something to consider as well. Another point we discuss is how to charge tenants for their usage. The majority of the time, we install the chargers on the house or common area utility meter. So the building ultimately is paying for the increased electric chargers. In other cases, we may install a separate meter just for the chargers or install the chargers directly on tenant meters. As I mentioned before, all of the chargers we install are equipped with software that allows the building to recoup the money spent for the extra electric usage on their utility bill and manage everything about the chargers, including rates, hours of operation, reservations, idling penalties, etc. The software is also a requirement for the rebate program. The building would have an admin account through the software provider via the website or app to manage all of this and link the building's operating account to receive the revenue from the chargers. The tenants would then have user accounts on the app where they would link their credit card in order to use the chargers and make payments, similar to an Uber account. Con Ed's rates are roughly 25 cents per kilowatt hour, for example, and the standard rate people use for charging is about 50 cents per kilowatt hour. This covers a 10% transaction fee that the software provider may charge, plus any other admin costs or initial investments the building took on. One more main point we'd like to discuss is level 2 chargers versus level 3. The far majority of chargers on the market today will fall under these two classifications. In reality, there is now a wide range of options within both classifications. Level 2 chargers are usually what we install in all multifamily residential buildings. They are all 240 volt, but can range from 30 to 100 amp. The charge time on a 30 amp would be about 10 hours for full charge, while the charge time on a 100 amp would be about 3. Somewhere within this range is usually what we recommend for residential buildings, where most of the charging will be done overnight and by people who live on the premises. Usually, level 2 is sufficient for commercial workplace chargers as well, where users are usually on the premises for up to 8 hours. Level 3 chargers are what you are starting to see in public parking lots, malls, etc. They are much larger in physical size and usually 480 volt and range from 100 to 400 amp. Most buildings will not have 480 volts available, so a new service or transformer usually needs to be installed for these chargers. The charge time on a 100 amp 480 volt charger would be about 2 hours, while the charge time on a 400 amp 480 volt charger would be about 20 minutes, which is currently the fastest charger on the market. These are recommended for high traffic public places where people are coming and going frequently.
Now, I want to start by relaying a bit of a story. Several years ago, 2 or 3 years ago, when I was working in Queens as a property manager, I had personal experience with a fire from a hoverboard, which is a skateboard that is mechanized. And this was in a co-op, 400 unit co-op, garden style. And one of the teenagers in the family had brought his hoverboard into charge in the family living room. This was a duplex. And sometime during the early evening, it ignited, exploded, and luckily the family was able to get out and the unit was completely destroyed. So I don't know if we've had any members who had experience with this yet, but I can tell you that it's very prescient that the association is having this information session, because this is a serious threat. And I'm sure that the other speakers will speak about the legalities of it. But one of the things we have to consider is in a garage setting, you have many buildings that have sprinklers. If there is a fire in an electric car, the batteries, lithium batteries, water will accelerate the fire. So if you have a sprinkler system, we have to start looking at what will extinguish a fire in an electric vehicle. And usually that's foam or dry chemical. What type of systems that would be employed in a garage scenario or setting have to be investigated with your fire safety companies. But water is not what you want to put on a lithium fire. Fire departments themselves are having difficulty putting fires out on highways. Disconnecting the battery is one of the things they say to do if you can get to it. But if something happens at 2 o'clock in the morning in a garage, I venture to say that increasing the ability of alarm systems, sensors in garages, rather than your first notification being a tripping of the the sprinkler system alarm. You want to have heat and fire sensors in the garages so that you will have early notification that someone can respond with the appropriate fire extinguishing material. A lot of these problems in skateboards and other types of things like scooters and other lithium powered devices are happening with aftermarket batteries. They're fairly safe, but not, I venture to say, the technology has not been perfected at this point, in my opinion. But those original batteries are probably safe. Replacement batteries, people tend to go to aftermarket sometimes. Those have been shown to be problematic around the city of New York and also in other areas of the country. So dealing with rules and regulations for apartment owners or condominium owners, renters need to be dealt with. In my opinion, you don't want these devices in any apartment. There may be a safe storage area in a basement or other place that's deemed safe. You have to check with the fire department. In that area where these are kept, like a bike room, there should be these fire sensors and extinguish systems that will allow for extinguishing fires that might happen. So it's important that these not be brought into apartments to charge, or even if they're not being charged, they need to be kept out of buildings. At this point, technology may improve, but until then, we have to take steps to make sure that these things don't ignite and don't cause damage. Again, the thing to do is to consult with fire safety experts, local fire department, and begin to develop a plan that will make your residential units or your commercial units, if you have people coming into your business that are storing bicycles that are powered by lithium batteries, need to consider that as well. So that's all I have to talk about in this particular segment. Be prepared. Watch out for garage scenarios where cars are stored. Sensors are very important to alert you to systems, to fires that might happen before the sprinkler systems go off.
The electric vehicle industry is only going up. And the other thing is, you have all these new rules with New York State requiring all new sales of cars being electric by 2040, I believe. So basically, we have no choice but to think about EV chargers in our buildings. And the other important thing to note is that most people do charge at home until towns and policies and community organizations, they come up with more public charging stations. It's not, we're going to have to look into the individual buildings. So some of the issues I think the building owners face are definitely the very high cost. It's very, very time consuming work. There is also high electricity bills. Your building may not have enough space. And also, as Paul mentioned, managing the sharing among multiple tenants. So looking at e-bikes have grown tremendously. The US in particular has been a bit slow, but now it's gaining momentum. There are even some automotive companies like Porsche has been investing in e-bikes. Mercedes-Benz has also been looking into it. And even EV companies like Rivian and Polestar are also looking into e-bikes. The number one issue, of course, are these fires that Stuart just spoke about. And there are, what the FDNY is saying right now in New York, there is an average of 3 fires a week. And that's just, we're only in March of this year. So Mayor Adams just signed a law where they have to be certified to a specific standard, to UL 2849, which I'm sure Paul can explain better than me. I'm not an electrician, but that might, sort of reduce some of these. I don't know, Stuart, if you've seen this, but I think a lot of what is happening is there's a lot of tampering of the batteries. And so that's what's also causing it. It's not the actual, when you first purchase it, that's not the issue, but these batteries die, people just do things with it, but it is very, very dangerous. And the other thing, what's been happening is they're charging multiple bikes on a single outlet. So that is also very dangerous. And and they're charging it inside their house. So a way to look at it is we would never sleep with a tank of propane next to our bed, right? So these e-bikes should never, ever, ever be allowed inside an apartment. So one of the biggest reasons why building owners should think about adding EV chargers is that there is definitely increase in property value. It used to be a luxury amenity, but now it's a necessity. And people are willing to pay. And as more and more people adopt electric vehicles, they're going to have to charge it somewhere. Sorry, this slide is so dense, but there are a lot of ways to, I think Paul mentioned, getting an assessment first and foremost of your building to see how much your building can handle and how much space there is. You have to be very diligent on all the different vendors that are out there. There are so many new startups that do, multiple things, and they're very, very creative. So yes, the problem is there are always these new startups popping up, but it's worth it to check into it. And of course, as we know, as the technology gets better, the prices should come down. But again, these are things that all building owners should put in their long-term strategy. The next thing building owners should look at are the costs. It is very, very expensive, but I think there are a lot of new startups that are being very creative with the financing. So that's something to look into. Determine the charging technology that your building can handle, and of course your budget. The other thing is, your building, maybe a couple of people may need, have EVs right now, but if you're going to be digging up your ground and putting in wires, you might as well plan for the future. So you may have 2-3 chargers now, if it's a small building, or as Paul had mentioned, 10% of your space. It's good to think about the future and maybe adding more. And locations and funding, there's lots of incentives and rebates that are out there. It is very complicated, but they are out there, and there's lots of people who can help, consultants like myself, or even Paul and all these other folks on this panel. There are tons of information on the DOE website. That's the Department of Energy. So there's a lot of money coming down the pipeline because there's a lot of regulations coming down, and with that, there will be funding. The other thing is, it will take time to put in these chargers. So that's something to consider. And lastly, the chargers, and Paul will be able to talk more about this, I'm sure, but they do require maintenance. So that's another thing to consider.
So first, what is an e-bike? Some of this you've probably heard, and some of this you probably know, but there is actually, as with everything I do, there's actually a legal definition of an e-bike. So it's a bicycle that has an electric motor to aid while you're pedaling. If you stop pedaling, the motor is supposed to stop. it propels you rather than doing it on its own. If it does it on its own, it's really not a bike, it's a motorcycle, essentially. So that is the legal distinction. Usually the output is limited to about 250 watts, and it must cut out when your speed reaches 20 miles an hour. That's in the United States. So that's just something to keep in mind. Again, over that, then it's no longer a bike or an e-bike, but that's the legal definition for whatever that's worth. So how does it work? There's usually a battery. The motor is housed either essentially on the bike or on the front of the rear. There's two ways of doing it, and I'm speaking a little bit of what, I don't know so much about this other than what I've researched, but there's these two ways impact how the technology works in terms of whether it's pushing the wheel or using the chain. For our purposes, it doesn't really matter. The only thing that you have to know is that there is a battery, which is what I'm going to get to next. That's really the most important thing for our purposes, because the batteries, it's not the motor really that's the problem, it's the battery that ends up being the problem and causing all the problems. So the batteries are typically, they're always lithium-ion batteries. Some of them can be, in some cases, the batteries from the bicycles can be removed for charging. Some of them they can't, so you have to bring the bicycle near to the outlet. The range on these bicycles varies a lot, so that impacts the capacity of the battery, the size of the battery. Some of these bikes even accept a second battery. Batteries are where the problems start and end mostly, so these are all things to keep in mind. So the risks, obviously the general risk is that it can catch on fire or it can explode. The reasons, there's a number of reasons. They can be damaged, they can get overheated. They can be, if you place it near a heat source, that's bad. So like, somebody brings their bike into their apartment, they place it near a radiator, plug it in, and that's an extra heat source. Or sunlight, if you leave it in the sunlight all day, again, that's a heat source. And some people, for whatever reason, penetrate the battery, or if something happens and the battery gets penetrated. Some people, they lose their charger. They use chargers that aren't intended for the battery, or the battery was involved, got in a flooding event somehow, and then still gets used. That can be bad also. For the most part, the risks for these batteries come when people get aftermarket or secondhand batteries that are not certified. There's a certification, a UL certification that the batteries go through. So when you first get the bike and it's new, if it has that brand new battery that came with it, that's usually okay. But again, as the prior speaker mentioned, these things, all these things, they can require a lot of maintenance and care. Leaving them unattended while charging is a bad idea. Leaving it charging overnight's a bad idea. Storing at room temperature is what's required. So if you store it either too hot or too cold, sometimes people might go away and leave the bike plugged in their apartment. They go away for a weekend, they leave it there, and then the heat goes off, or the heat gets on and it's too hot. So that can be bad. Also, what a lot of people do, they block their, most of your apartments probably only have one door in and out, that one egress. So the people bring their bike into their apartment and they plug it in somewhere near that front door, blocking that front door. So then if there's a fire, now they can't get out of the apartment. It's another problem. So that's another thing to keep in mind. Now, obviously the fires we've talked about, there's some statistics, more, I think 220 in 2022. Most of these in New York City, but in Westchester also. There's been a sharp increase from prior years, but that's because they're more prevalent. And the FDNY says it's often triggered by overuse and improper maintenance and improperly maintained batteries. That's usually what happens. And the problem is these things catch fire, and the fire goes and it spreads very quickly. It can be dangerous. So now getting to the end result, this is the, I'll read this. This is our suggested text of, if you want to ban e-bikes in your building, which we think you can do, and we've recommended to a lot of our buildings. So the board of directors has serious concerns with fire safety issues, and therefore effective whatever date, all e-bikes, electric scooters, hoverboards, and other similar transportation or mobility devices using lithium-ion batteries are prohibited and cannot be kept, used, stored, repaired, possessed, and or charged in the cooperative's building, with the sole exception of wheelchair or mobility devices that are used by persons who are handicapped or disabled. In the event that there is damage as a result of the storage, use, repair, or maintenance of a banned lithium-ion battery device, the shareholder in whose apartment the device is used, stored, charged, kept, or placed will be fully responsible for all damages. So that's the text of what we suggest passing as a rule. And I'm going to go into that in a second. A lot of times we get questions about, well, what about, cell phones? What about other things that have lithium-ion batteries? Well, those batteries is not the same real concern with them lighting on fire for a variety of technological reasons, not all of which I understand, but mainly that the capacity of those batteries is a lot less. The capacity of the batteries, the wattage and the amount of storage of energy that the batteries for these e-bikes has is much greater. It's a much higher capacity because of, think about what it's doing. So that is where the increased risk comes, whereas a cell phone doesn't have that same size battery usually, so it's not quite it's not the same kind of risk. Now most places there are for most proprietary leases, there is language that talks about things that you can ban and things having to do with your insurance, and that you can ban things, and you can stop things that if it was to increase your insurance. So there is the at least that gives you the ability to pass a rule like this, among other reasons why you probably could. You could do it as an amendment to your proprietary lease, but amending the proprietary lease is a much harder task, as it requires a supermajority, typically a supermajority vote of the shareholders, whereas to pass a rule for your house rules or rules and regulations, that only requires the board to take a vote and pass by a majority of the board to adopt that new rule. So it's usually much easier. You're not typically going to get pushback on it, and it's usually something that is not going to get challenged. It could get challenged, but mostly it gets challenged. It's something that there's decent chances that your rule will be honored. Obviously, you have to look at your particular lease and your particular bylaws to be sure, but that's usually the route that we recommend taking.